NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the world, with a combined defense budget of over $1.28 trillion. It accounts for more than half of global military spending. Its members include the largest economies and strongest armies, and its nuclear deterrence has kept Europe secure for decades. But now, the alliance is at a crossroads. President Trump has openly questioned NATO's value, arguing that the US is spending too much while its allies aren't doing enough. He has long criticized European nations for relying on American military power, and now he's demanding they increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP, a number that many simply can't afford. This demand comes at a critical moment. In 2014, NATO members agreed to hit a 2% GDP defense spending goal by 2024, a benchmark that 23 out of 32 members have now reached. But is 2% enough? Trump says no. To put things into perspective, the US spends more on defense than any other country, $755 billion in 2024, which is 3.4% of its economy. That's more than double what China and Russia spend combined. The top NATO spender after the US? Poland, at 4.1%. But most European countries are still struggling to reach even 2%. The real question is the US truly carrying NATO? Or is this more about political leverage? And if NATO members can't or won't meet these new demands, could this be the moment Trump decides to pull the US out of the alliance for good? If that happens, what would it mean for global security, America's influence, and the future of Europe? Let's talk about it. Alright, if the United States walks away from NATO, the consequences will be immediate and far-reaching. Some analysts believe that Europe will simply step up and fill the gap, but the reality is far more complicated. NATO is more than just a military alliance. It's a system of shared resources, intelligence, and logistics that allows its members to operate effectively. If the US withdraws, NATO wouldn't collapse overnight, but it would face massive setbacks in three key areas: budget and military power, nuclear deterrence, and global military strategy. Let's talk about it one by one, starting with budget and military power shift. There's a common claim that the US pays 66% of NATO's budget, but that's not true. In reality, the US contributes about 15.8% of NATO's official annual budget. However, the bigger picture isn't just about direct contributions. It's about who has the most military capability. Right now, the US military presence in Europe is critical. The US has over 100,000 troops stationed across Europe, primarily in Germany, Italy, and the UK. These forces aren't just there to protect NATO members. They serve as a deterrent against any potential aggressor, particularly Russia. If the US exits NATO, then the first thing the US would do is to likely pull out a significant portion of its troops, weakening NATO's rapid response capabilities. This will result in loss of key military bases, especially for US, as US forces rely on European bases not just for NATO missions, but for global operations in the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. There will also be reduced intelligence sharing. Right now, NATO operates as a coordinated intelligence network. Without US participation, Europe loses access to cutting-edge American surveillance and cybersecurity defenses. Europe still has strong militaries, but coordination and logistics would take a massive hit. Countries would need to fill the gaps left by the US, and that wouldn't happen overnight. One of the biggest threats in a world without a US-backed NATO is the loss of nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate defense mechanism, preventing large-scale wars through mutually assured destruction. But here's the problem: the US controls 87% of NATO's nuclear arsenal. If the US pulls out, what's left? Only 515 warheads would remain, divided between the UK and France. The UK's Trident nuclear missiles rely on American spare parts and maintenance. Without continued US support, these missiles could eventually degrade. France has an independent nuclear arsenal, but it has refused to integrate its nuclear strategy into NATO doctrine. Without American nuclear deterrence, would Russia see this as an opportunity? Would NATO's reduced nuclear stockpile encourage Russian aggression? Historically, Russia has tested NATO's limits whenever there is perceived weakness. Some experts worry that a US exit could embolden Moscow to take a more aggressive stance, particularly in regions like the Baltics and Eastern Europe. Europe could try to expand its nuclear capabilities, but that would take years, and political opposition within Europe makes it unlikely. The nuclear umbrella provided by the US has been a key stabilizer. Without it, NATO's deterrence power could weaken significantly. At first glance, it might seem like leaving NATO only affects Europe, but that's not the case. The US relies on NATO bases for its global military strategy, and pulling out would force a complete overhaul of American military logistics. Right now, the US Navy and Air Force depend on European bases for operations in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Without NATO, supply lines become longer, costlier, and riskier. Aircraft carriers and naval fleets rely on supply bases. While US supercarriers can operate globally, the ships that support them cannot. Without friendly NATO ports, the US Navy would have to operate much closer to home. Air Force projection becomes harder. Long-range bombers and fighter jets require mid-air refueling and base access. Losing NATO's infrastructure makes global military operations much more difficult. China and Russia would benefit. Without NATO, the US would struggle to maintain its military dominance outside its own borders. Meanwhile, Russia and China would gain influence in Europe, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. And let's not forget the economic consequences. The US defense industry could take a major hit. NATO allies buy billions of dollars worth of American-made military equipment, including F-35 fighter jets, tanks, and missile defense systems. If the US leaves NATO, European countries may shift to domestic alternatives, or look to France, Germany, or even Israel for defense technology. That's not just a loss of military contracts, it's a loss of tens of thousands of American jobs in defense manufacturing. So if the US exits NATO, the alliance wouldn't immediately collapse, but it would face severe disruptions in military readiness, nuclear deterrence, and global strategy. A US exit from NATO wouldn't just weaken the alliance, it would reshape global power. Without the United States as its backbone, NATO would be forced to reinvent itself, while Russia and China would look for opportunities to expand their influence. If the US walks away, Europe is left with a stark reality. They would have to take full responsibility for their own defense. In theory, this sounds simple. After all, NATO would still have the second largest military budget in the world, around $410 billion. That's more than China spends on defense and 4 times more than Russia. But money doesn't automatically translate into power. Right now, Europe lacks the infrastructure, logistics, and unified military command that the US brings to the table. Building that up would take years, if not decades, and that's assuming European nations can agree on how to move forward, which is a big if. Can Germany and France lead NATO 2.0? Some believe that Germany and France would take the lead in shaping NATO's future without the US, but there's one major roadblock: they don't agree on how to do it. France has long pushed for an EU-led defense force, independent from NATO. They argue that Europe needs to take charge of its own security rather than relying on the US. The UK, on the other hand, refuses to be part of an EU army. Britain has always been skeptical of giving Brussels control over defense matters. Even after Brexit, the UK sees itself as a key player in European security, but outside of an EU-controlled force. Then there's Poland and the Baltic states, countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which fear Russia the most. These nations have zero trust in Europe's ability to defend itself without US backing. If the US exits NATO, they might seek direct security agreements with Washington instead of relying on a weaker European defense structure. The result? A divided Europe with no clear leadership. Some nations would try to stay in a NATO-like structure, while others would pursue their own security agreements, and the more divided Europe becomes, the more vulnerable it gets. We've already seen what happens when Russia senses weakness in NATO. they invaded Ukraine. Now imagine a world where the US is no longer backing NATO. Would Russia see this as an opportunity? Would they test NATO's limits even more? Without the US, NATO would still have money and troops, but it would lose its strongest military deterrent. If European countries are still figuring out how to coordinate their defenses, Russia could take advantage of the chaos. Some experts believe that Putin might escalate pressure on Eastern Europe. He could test NATO's response with cyber attacks, military buildups, or even a direct challenge to countries like Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, knowing that Europe might hesitate without US backing. He could push deeper into Ukraine, banking on the idea that NATO wouldn't intervene militarily without American leadership. And Russia isn't the only country that would benefit from a divided NATO. China has watched NATO closely, especially as the alliance provided military aid and intelligence to Ukraine. Beijing sees NATO's unity as a warning sign, a reminder that the West can still come together against a common enemy. But if NATO weakens, China gains leverage, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. If the US withdraws from NATO, China could see it as proof that America is retreating from global commitments. This could embolden China to take a more aggressive stance on Taiwan, believing that the US won't want to get involved in another international conflict. Smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific, such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea, might question whether they could still count on the US for protection. Some might even shift closer to China's sphere of influence. In other words, a weaker NATO could mean a stronger China, just as much as it benefits Russia. So, would leaving NATO make America stronger? No. It would do the opposite. Walking away from NATO wouldn't just weaken Europe, it would hurt the US as well. America would lose military bases, intelligence sharing, and key alliances that help it project power across the world. Russia and China would seize the opportunity to expand their influence, while the US would be left with fewer strategic advantages and weaker global influence. And economically, it would be a disaster. The US defense industry relies heavily on arms sales to NATO allies, and if those contracts disappear, thousands of American jobs will be on the line. Meanwhile, Europe will be forced to develop its own military technology, cutting the US out of a market it has dominated for decades. The reality is, NATO isn't just about protecting Europe, it's about maintaining American power on a global scale. Leaving wouldn't just cut costs, it would cut America's influence, military strength, and economic leverage. So, no. Leaving NATO wouldn't make the US stronger, it would make it weaker, more isolated, and far less secure. And that's all for today's video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more such content. See you in the next video.